Good evening. Welcome. Appreciate everybody being here tonight. We'll be in, where will we be? We're not in Acts. I will not be fooled. Page 16, lesson 8. Hope that sounds familiar. Page 16, lesson 8, Galatians 1. And if I had to kind of summarize where we were, I would say that the map portion of this class is just ended, and the timeline portion is just beginning. So we're gonna move past. I got a couple of maps, but they're ones you've seen 100 times. But we are going to get a little bit into the timeline tonight, and then over the next couple of classes, because there's a little bit of debate about exactly where we are on the timeline as Paul writes Galatians. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Before we dig into what we have here in lesson 8, John, do you mind to start us with a word of prayer?
Almighty God, our Father in heaven, we come to you this evening so grateful, Lord, for your many blessings. We're thankful for the day that you've given us. We're thankful for the opportunities we've had today to live in your creation, to see the wonder of it, and to work and do the things that you have given us to do. We're most especially thankful for this time we have to gather as your people, to gather and open your word, to read from it, to study it, so that we can know you, that we can understand your will for our lives, your will for your church, and the task that is set before your church, and spreading the gospel, and telling others about our living Savior, Jesus. And we're thankful for this study. We're thankful for the truth and the words that have been preserved so that we can look into those things, that we can take them into our hearts, that we can examine our lives, examine the problems and issues that face us in our world today, both personally and in the church, in our homes, in our daily lives. That we can see that temptations and troubles of mankind are not new. You have given us the wisdom and the truth to base our lives around, that we can overcome these things. Not alone in temptation, but that we have great hope and a great strength through your word, through your promises. God, we pray that you will help us to read and study these things and be willing to change our minds and change our will to be according to you, and not try to change your word to be into our will. We're thankful most of all for Jesus, love and his sacrifice, and the hope that we have in eternity with you.
Amen. If you need material tonight, if you would please raise your hand. Brad has both books and sheets tonight. And so if you just need a sheet of tonight's lesson, or if you'd like a full book, raise your hand and he can accommodate that. And I'm going to take one of the sheets myself, Brad. It's like my little device is about to run out of battery. I'm going to have to have a little plan B. That's fine. So, a couple over here. Thank you. A couple of leftover thoughts from our time together on Sunday. And then if you have some, we'll add those also. And part of it leads into question number 1 here on page 16. But we kind of ended our time on Sunday talking about what made the failure of the Galatians notable. And kind of ended the class on this thought that, remember in Acts chapter 14, on our first trip through this area, what specifically do we know about the leadership of these churches? They had rightly appointed leadership. They had elders. And I think that this letter should be read as written, not only to elders, but two elders of these congregations. And this feeling of, guys, what are we doing? I am astonished. I think probably felt most impactfully, you'd hope, by the eldership. And so I think it was Brad that asked the question, so what do, and Brad, you'll do better than I would. Help me with the question you asked right after class.
How do you mitigate it?
That was the word I couldn't find. How do you mitigate this? How do you, and it's probably worth our conversation for just a moment, is if we are in a congregation that we feel like has correctly appointed leaders. And if we think that we are somehow superior to these Galatians, we should probably check our egos. How do we mitigate against the same thing happening? I think that's an excellent question, a kind of application where the rubber meets the road question. Ms. Carroll. I don't know about leading, but they allowed the congregation to be led. They allowed these men from Jerusalem to come up, allowed them to speak, allowed them to lead the flock astray. And it probably wouldn't be a stretch to say we're led astray in some way themselves. They allowed it to happen. Brad?
So just to elaborate, Roger brought up a point. If it can happen then,
yes.
with everything they had access to,
yes.
How do you mitigate what we have access to?
Yep. So, you ask it, you get the first chance to answer it.
Well, I mean, just adherence to the word and not deviating from it.
Yep.
Would be a great always kind of checking each other. I think we have to have a relationship where we always check each other. I mean, be uncomfortable, but.
Yep. Nope. Both those points are well taken. Accountability between one another and dogged, relentless commitment to the text. We have that. We have that advantage where they don't, right? They had, especially the non-Jewish of the group. They would not have had we've talked about before the advantage of the written text that they could always go back to, but they obviously left the word that they had been taught. Yes.
Talks about what the gospel is, that God raised him from the dead, and that's the gospel we preach to you, and why he deserted that. And so anytime we deviate from that good news, having to take from, we're opening ourselves up to a different gospel. And so to further specify Brad's question, and I don't want to be the first chance to answer it, but to me it comes down to mitigating, not going after a different gospel means navigating where is we either tend to go legalist or, anything goes, you can live how you want, you're free from the law. How do you navigate that balance? We're free from the law, we have liberty, but we're not free to act how we want. And so it comes down to kind of those kinds of things, navigating that freedom.
Yeah, so without trying to, I won't do justice to try to summarize all that, but Tara said it is clear that the Galatian issue in specifics, we'll put words in your mouth, something had been added to the simplicity of the gospel. And it's easy, you go either way, either add to or take away from the simplicity of the gospel, but perhaps the one that we need to keep our eye on is adding to. But commitment to the word, commitment to holding fast that word, is got to be the fail-safe against both those things. Either against, again, it's not trying to put words in Tara's mouth, either against the legalistic stripping away the grace from the word, and also from the taking advantage of freedom that is in the gospel. Either one of those paths. So that is something to hold on to. Paul.
Seems like back then they didn't have the full knowledge of the word. They just took words from other people.
So, yeah, Paul's point, I think, is worth thinking about, is what tendency of people what trap did the Galatians fall into? One of them is people with a reputation that seemed to be more intelligent or from a place that was well respected. They seemed to get more respect, and they were able to lead them astray, perhaps because of where they're from or what their background was, or what credentials they had. So again, obviously it starts with commitment to the text, but is that, again, a human frailty that anybody is susceptible to that we should be aware of as one of those mitigating factors? Steve? Yes.
They had the text. They had the book. They had the word, if you will.
Yes.
And to them, when they came in their midst, that's what they said. We are speaking authoritatively from God. He says you must be circumcised. You are a part of our family. Therefore, you must be circumcised. Paul doesn't just say it here as we talked about. Do not go down this road, because it is we are spiritually circumcised. It is not about our physical. With himself, as he says, as well as with all of his people that he was
Yes.
against the flesh versus the spirit.
Yes.
And this is the same thing. The Judaizers come in, they're saying, we are the spiritual ones. We are the chosen ones. We have the text. So when we say we need to stay in the word, what do? We do the same thing. So when we fight against each other, we say, well, I'm saying what the word says. No, I'm saying what the word says. And we clash. And what does that look like to the world? We're not one. Paul says be unified, don't be divided.
Yeah.
Jesus says the same thing. He prays it to God. We're not. We're doing the same exact thing. We've got the book. What do we do with the book? And I think that's where Tara might have been going to. Leaning towards what are we saying about our vision towards the word and spiritual truth. Is it real? Are we being authentic with it? Are we actually studying it? Or are we going apart from it and then going our own way?
Yeah, and we'll pick on something you said there, Steve, is we'll talk about later in the book why is the conversation in chapter 5 about the flesh and the spirit, why is that not a deviation from what's been talked about the rest of the book, but why is it the whole point? And it fits into the rest of the book, that reliance on the flesh versus the spirit, it fits in the conversation of circumcision, and that's why it doesn't like all of a sudden we take this detour, it fits in that whole conversation. Cody? Yeah. Deviation from the the gospel. Don't want to spend too much time on that, but I appreciate Brad's question, and I think that's one to consider, yes.
Just looking at verse 6, it seems like Paul thought they had a way to avoid this. He says, I'm amazed that this has happened. And at least in Paul's mind, the Galatians had everything they needed to mitigate this problem.
Yes.
And so if they had, Roger pointed, if it could happen to them, it could happen to us. But if they could have mitigated it, we could have mitigated it as well. And it does seem like the thrust of his message is all about authority. The authority that he has as an apostle and the authority of the message of Christ in his death, burial, and resurrection. And it seems as if what they were hearing was, you mentioned earlier, adding to, but it was fully accepting of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, but working backwards into the law of Moses. How do we keep that from happening in our lives? I think what Cody mentioned, but also Acts 17. Acts 17 when the Bereans said, we don't care who you are. We need to bounce this off of something. What did they have to bounce that off of? They didn't have the new text either.
Yes.
But they had something that they could bounce this off of to say, okay, we see how all this lines up with what God has been doing.
Yep. And there is I'm going to leave that alone. I'm not going to do it. Any other thoughts? Jim?
Well, that may be why Paul
Yes.
Paul
Yes.
there was evidence of that.
Yes. And does that tendency remain? Of course it does, right? We all know speakers or preachers that we think a lot of and that we think have always done good work, and it's easy to become man focused, right? Yeah, it's very human nature. So again, I think that would be part of watching out. What are we holding on to? Annie? I mean, much later, but yeah. Yes. Yes. And that we talked about the thunder kind of out the gate opening. I don't mean to cut anybody off. Do you have something? Leads us, I think, and I think Roger already set us up for this in question 1 here on page 16. Why is Paul's defense so important? the defense, and basically what we're getting ready to read over the next chapter and a half, is Paul's defense of his gospel, as opposed to these others, which are not another, right? But Paul's defense of his gospel, why is that? Why is this particular defense in Galatians 1, why is it so critically important? Paul?
Because it came from God,
It came from God. And
not man.
And if it came from man, what are the consequences of that? One's as good as another, right? How can we distinguish between what's another gospel, verse 6, verse 8? How do we distinguish what's another gospel from what's the genuine article if they all just kind of came from the teaching of the whichever rabbi that you happen to listen to? You find that, right, in Jewish writings, as I'm sure you've seen, like, well, if those who listen to this rabbi kind of believe this way, but those who listen to this rabbi kind of believe this way. And there's schisms even in the Jewish faith based on the rabbi that you listen to. Because in generalities, the Jews really believed in the tradition of the elders, right? The tradition of the handed down spoken word. They took the text seriously, but not always literally. And the tradition of what had been taught down by the rabbi that was so well respected was held in higher and sometimes higher regard than the words themselves. I think that's important to keep in mind through this section.
Boils down to interpretation
In what way, Paul?
of the word. Some people might look at it one way, and other people might look at it a different way.
And so how do we get past that where right, to where we're not divided, as Steve noted, but that we can be united in the one gospel?
And that's the anxiety that comes from the freedom of the gospel. So we like, I'm going to get married. Tell me how to be a wife. I want instructions. In the New Testament, God gives the guideline of submitting to my husband.
Yes.
That can look a lot of different ways that are right. The way that I submit to you is I make a lot of decisions that you ask me to make for you because you don't have time to do that or you trust me to make those decisions. In another marriage, submission might look completely different. The husband might make all the decisions and the wife submits a different way. That makes us uncomfortable because your way of following that guideline, that paradigm that God has set out there looks different from mine. And so are you wrong? Am I wrong? Which way is the right way? Well, causes anxiety when there's lots of right ways to obey a commandment. And so I think that's where the navigating between the liberty and the legalism is tricky because some things we don't want to misinterpret gospel truths. Some things are a matter of interpretation, parenting, marriage, the way elders lead a church, the way we do a bunch of other things that cause division when really if we recognize the freedom, the way we're free from the law under Christ and God gives us guidelines but liberty, we would be a lot more united, I think. Well, the church doesn't believe in doing whatever we do, but we're free to make that call as long as it isn't contradicting the truth of the gospel.
And that, obviously, that's a much more complex conversation. I could agree with all that. So, but marrying that up against, man, how do we make sure that doesn't become an adulterated or a different gospel, because that has really serious consequences
It can become a different gospel either way.
in verses 6 through 8. So definitely appreciate that. I would just add that because verse 6 through 8 are in there, because we went through this whole class about how thunderously Paul came out. If it's that important, then identifying the source of his gospel becomes critical. I think that it becomes, he has made it this important because of what he said about it has to be proven true. He's made it that important in those first 10 verses. So
Even in verse 11, when he said the gospel that was preached by me, play on the Greek word for gospel is actually like transliterated the gospel that was gospeled by me. So he's not even calling it what I preached to you, really. He's calling I gospeled the gospel to you.
and it wasn't man's gospel. That is a really, like we've already talked about that, that's kind of the key point that he's making there in those verses, which leads to this, by the way, I mean, you can see the map, we know where we've been, we know where we're going, y'all know that. This comment, I received it by revelation. I'll come back to you, Miss Carol. This comment, I received it, this was not man's gospel. I received it through a revelation, verse 12. Your version may render that slightly different, but that is either I received it by revelation, through revelation, in some way that's in the text. And that's a little bit of a challenging concept, perhaps. Tell me what, in your study, what do we take that to mean? What is that? What are we to take that to mean? That what Paul received, he said he wasn't taught, which is interesting. He wasn't taught. What does that mean? But he received it by revelation. Help me with what that must mean, Steve. Yes. Yes.
In that instant, in that conversation that he had, there was a whole lot more possibly given to Paul than we.
Yes.
And then, of course, the ongoing revelation of the Holy Spirit all of that was him.
Of course.
The just of it, and that goes back to a long time. What is the gospel? We all know, obviously.
Yes.
And if we can scale it down, then a lot of what we're talking about here becomes more able to be grasped, more able to actually be seen by us as God-given.
Okay. Help me with what you mean.
First, Paul, in my opinion, defines what the gospel is. He actually said,
Gospel I preached into you.
says that he died, and he rose. He goes on to say that, 500 witnesses on to give more detailed information. Of course, the about resurrection. But the initial starting of that letter defines, in my mind, what the gospel very good is. That's what it is. And like you're trying to get us to understand that it's so important to determine whether it's man-made or God-made. One or the other. Because if it's man-made, then it can be God in the religious world.
For sure.
One's as good as the other.
For sure.
As long as you believe, you're fine. So what do you distinguish? Well, it really comes down to what the gospel is. Truly what it is. When you see it as a whole and then condense it down, it comes down into the belief that Jesus lived, he died, he was buried, and he was resurrected. Those things are the basics of it all.
And so the question is that I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but is that the totality of what Paul says was revealed to him? I think it has to be, there's got to be something beyond that. I take your point, and I appreciate it. Was everything that Paul learned about the gospel, did it occur on the road, the gospel? Did all of that occur on the road to Damascus? I don't know that I know that answer. And I don't know that we can know that answer. We obviously get this really obscure kind of reference that Paul gives in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 about somebody who saw miraculous visions, and he seems maybe to be referring to himself, but it's hard to know. And what does that play into what we're talking about here at all? I don't know, and I don't know if we can know. I don't know if it's important to know that we do know, or pinpoint exactly when did this revelation happen, or how did it happen. We got to believe it did happen. Ron.
But his knowledge, he seems to have the 3 years of knowledge the apostles gained from walking with Christ,
Yeah.
compacted into the small time from getting it on to Damascus to where he's teaching.
Yeah.
So, I'm leaning kind of what you were saying. I agree over here, but definitely a little beyond where I don't know if this is almost similar to some of the revelations. Maybe some of the Old Testament prophets got a sense of knowledge of where they got how they got to work. I don't think we're ever going to know exactly how that. But clearly there was something beyond what we're considering. I think the laws of nature taking place of how these guys.
Or some combination of the two, right?
Correct.
Yeah, I've had a hard time.
I'm sorry, just real quick, I just want to finish where I was going to
Sure.
say it correctly. Because what you and Ron are talking about is exactly where it's going. Revelation is only a portion, like I said, of what that word means. The ongoing is it's a revealing of something.
Yes.
You know, and I did say about the Holy Spirit. So we don't know. We don't know when he got all that information. But it's obvious, just like Ron was just saying, that a lot compacted in a short period of time. Well, how did he get all that? And all that?
Yes.
So to answer your question,
And I think that at least my way I would think about it is there was something divine clearly that happened. He received by revelation. But everything else we see how God works, I don't know that we should expect that Paul didn't have a part in that, and going back to the Old Testament text that he knew and comparing to it and seeing how it fit together and trying to see how the story wove and now seeing those texts in a different way. I think we'd be way off base to say that he did not have a cooperative part in deepening his own understanding. For sure, just like we all do, right? How's the Holy Spirit work in us? It works through our study and through, the work that we put into it, that we can be changed just in a dialed up way. Kind of helps me understand maybe what Paul is talking about here. Even though, again, we're not truly ever going to understand it in my judgment. Cody. Annie. He's deferring. Yeah. Agreed. Agreed. No. Cody? Yes. Yeah, so the road to Damascus we know for sure. And then he mentions an instance where he was in Jerusalem in the temple and fell into a trance. He mentions that in one of his defenses in the book of Acts. We know what he says. So I don't know that we should even assume that there was a singular event, right? To your point, over a period of time. Involved in his own study, and in time in Tarsus, and in time in Arabia, and in time in Damascus, in a series of events, the depth of understanding the gospel happened. I think perhaps if we think that it's a flash of insight and he knew everything he was supposed to know, we're selling a little bit short both his background and his desire to study.
Way above
Yes.
people of his own age. So he was zealous for it. Now he's zealous for it.
He was advanced in Judaism, to Carol's point, which when you think about the providence of God, why did that make him an ideal vessel for what needed to happen, as he had the background to do it. But taking that knowledge and applying it in a new way. Kyle?
It seems as if he makes this statement to reveal not necessarily when he got the information, but who he got it from.
Correct.
And I wonder if that's really his main point. The phrase "I received it through," that "I received" it's added in. That's not original to the text.
Right.
So what he says is, I didn't receive it from a man. I wasn't taught it from a man, but through a revelation of Jesus Christ. It's almost as if somebody's asking, "Who's your rabbi?" That's what we want to know. Is we've got somebody else coming, and here's their authority. Their authority is, we got this information. We have this information shared to you. You should listen to it because where we come from. We're from Jerusalem. We likely have Rabbi so-and-so that agrees with us. Who's Paul's rabbi? His answer to that is Jesus.
Yes.
I like that because later on he says he didn't go immediately to Jerusalem.
Right.
To study with the people in Jerusalem. He didn't have to.
And I think, Carol, combining those 2 points, I think that would have been unique, right? Is that the tradition would have been you go immediately to learn from these rabbis, right? You go sit at the feet of Gamaliel, as it were. That Paul said, hey, I intentionally did not do that because I had a better rabbi, that my gospel came from another source, that I did not need the verification or the certification of those who others might think to be superior. Anyway, I mean to beat that to death.
Well, and it also makes his gospel then become the yardstick to which every other gospel has to be measured to. Because if somebody is coming and they're saying to them, hey, we believe Christ just like you, but you forgot to be circumcised. You have to go back and do that. Well, this is Christ's gospel, what Paul's saying. This is the message Christ sent. So if Christ forgot it, similar to the 1 Corinthians 15, Christ didn't really raise from the dead. Like, why would you, if he's truly God and it's his gospel and he forgot part of it, maybe we shouldn't be following any of it.
The same point carries through to chapter 2. We're going to talk about we're going to talk about this in our next class. But verse 6 of chapter 2, it makes a really interesting comment to exactly Carol's point when he says, those who seemed influential added nothing to me. That is maybe the summation of the end of chapter 1 and the whole part of chapter 2. Those who seemed influential added nothing to me. I was glad to have their support. My life was going to be easier if we were on the same page. But if we weren't, I wasn't changing pages. I was just going to have a much harder job because they weren't on the same page with me. But seeing that they were, that made me very happy. I knew I could move forward and it was going to be a little bit easier for me, but they added nothing to me. Okay, let's move on to question 2 in the time we have left. The end of chapter 1 begins a timeline, and if you'll see my amateurish effort, you can go back in your book a few pages. But how does the timeline from Galatians match up with the timeline from Acts? And for the sake of time, I'm going to skip ahead to my answer to that question in just a few verses. And that is, at least the first few rows of what I'm showing here, I think are pretty much agreed upon. And that is, we know that the persecution of Christians that he mentions in Galatians 1 and chapter 13 is the persecution of Christians that we obviously read about in Acts chapter 8 and Acts chapter 9. After the stoning of Stephen, Acts chapter 8 and Acts chapter 9, which, again, there's some debate about this, but 34, 35 AD. When he says in verse 15 that he revealed his son to me, we obviously know when that happened initially, and that was on the road to Damascus when Jesus was literally revealed to Paul. Acts chapter 9, those first few verses, we see how that ties together. The comment about I departed to Arabia and then back to Damascus, I think we should probably be careful about saying he spent 3 years in Arabia. I think that steps outside the text. All the text says is that he went to Arabia and came back to Damascus, and 3 years later went to Jerusalem. We don't know how long he was in Arabia. It may have been a weekend, probably more than that. But we know that he spent some time in Arabia and came back to Damascus. That seems to best line up with Acts chapter 9 and verse 23. And it might be good just to go back and turn quickly to Acts chapter 9. We read this, if you recall, a few weeks ago. But when he, verse 22, saw increased and confounded the Jews in Damascus, in verse 23, and when many days had passed. Again, Luke doesn't give us a ton of detail about the many days there, but the timeline seems to work best if those many days includes this trip to Arabia and back. That it was up to maybe 3 years that Luke interjects into that one phrase in the end of Acts chapter 9 and verse 23. And then verse 18, we kind of get this first mile marker. He says, after 3 years, we assume that means 3 years after his conversion, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem. It seems most consistent to tie this to this trip to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 9. Remember what happened in Acts chapter 9 when he went to Jerusalem? What was the outcome of that? Anybody remember in Acts 9? No, yeah, nobody wanted, they were concerned, right? They were concerned, if you remember. They doubted his conversion. Thank you. That's a better way to say it, Roger. And until someone specifically came to his side, Barnabas, right? Now, one of the last question on the page is what challenges are presented here. One of the challenges is that he says in Galatians, I only met with 2 apostles, right? Isn't that what he says in Galatians chapter 1? I only met with Peter and James. In Acts 9, it seems to say that he went to the apostles, that Barnabas took him to the apostles. The only way to make that make sense is if that only means Peter and James. So maybe somewhat awkward, but still, it's not a contradiction. It still fits in the text. In that Galatians 1:18, after 3 years I went to Jerusalem, ties to that trip in Acts chapter 9. And then it says in verse 21, again in Galatians 1, afterwards I went to Syria and Cilicia. That does tie to Acts chapter 9 and verse 30, where it says, after this, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. That ties together. That seems to make sense. And we know he spent some time there in Tarsus. After that, his point in Galatians is not to give a detailed itinerary of everything he did, right? His point is to prove that the gospel didn't come from man. And so there's a few things that we don't get in Galatians that Luke tells us in Acts. The last thing I'll say, my personal opinion is that this visit in Acts chapter 11, when Paul and Barnabas take relief to the saints in Jerusalem, I don't think that's mentioned in the book of Galatians. That is not a uniform belief. There's a lot of people who think that Galatians chapter 2 and verse 1 is about that visit. I happen to think that visit is skipped, and what we're talking about in chapter 2 is about Acts 15. But I did want to show that everything at the end of chapter 1 lines up really, really well with what Luke tells us in the book of Acts, and that should make sense to us. So next class on Sunday, we will dive into Galatians chapter 2. We'll talk primarily about what the text really means, and then one class later, we'll dig into some of the timeline issues between Galatians 2 and Acts 15. Thank you for your patience and for the patience of all the young people out there. Thank you.